Welcome to the Books of Titans podcast, where I seek truth in the world's great books. I'm your host, Eric Rostad, coming to you from the beautiful Books of Titans studio in Franklin, Tennessee. My goal is to read 200 of the great books over the next 10 years and share what I'm learning. I'll talk a bit about each book, tie ideas together from a variety of genres, and share the one thing I always hope to remember from each of the great books. Today I'm going to cover the Peloponnesian War by Thucydides. This is from book 35 from my 2024 reading list, and Thucydides is selection 14 from my Great Books reading list. Well, I'm going to start by reading sections from the very first paragraph of this work. So here we go. Thucydides, an Athenian, wrote the history of the war between the Peloponnesians and the Athenians, beginning at the moment that it broke out, and believing that it would be a great war, and more worthy of relation than any that had preceded it. This belief was not without its grounds. The preparations of both the combatants were in every department in the last state of perfection, and he could see the rest of the Hellenic race taking sides in the quarrel, those who delayed doing so at once having it in contemplation. Indeed, this was the greatest movement yet known in history, not only of the Hellenes, but of a large part of the barbarian world. I had almost said of mankind. Then continuing down a little further, all point to the conclusion that there was nothing on a greater scale, either in war or in other matters, end quote. So that's how we get started here. So Thucydides is an Athenian, and he's writing about a war between the Peloponnesians and the Athenians. And being an Athenian, he gives us insight that he is viewing this war from one side, but he views this as the greatest war that has ever happened. And it's important to note that the war that immediately precedes this is the Persian War, the war that is highlighted by Herodotus. And then many years earlier, you would have had the Trojan War. So he's saying that this Peloponnesian War is greater than anything that has come before it. He continues on a few pages later and kind of raises the stakes. He says this. I have written my work not as an essay, which is to win the applause of the moment, but as a possession for all time. I'll end the quote there. So he is saying that this is not just a book about this particular war that's just meant to be for this time. This is a possession for all time. And he was on to something there by the mere fact that we are still reading this book. I'm covering it in this podcast episode. It's something we're still discussing. It's required reading at West Point. So it is an important work. It is a great book, and I look forward to talking about it more in this episode. I want to continue reading just from that section where he says, as a possession for all time, the Median War, so that would be the Persian War, the greatest achievement of past times, yet found a speedy decision in 2 actions by sea and 2 by land. The Peloponnesian War went on for a very long time, and there occurred during it disasters of a kind and number that no other similar period of time could match. So let me end the quote there. And this book covers the Peloponnesian War. It does not cover the entire Peloponnesian War. The entire Peloponnesian War lasted from 431 BC to 404 BC. This work abruptly stops. It abruptly ends in the middle of the war in the year 411. And then it is taken up by Xenophon in his book Hellenika. And so you don't get the full war in this one. We're not totally sure why Thucydides stopped at that point, because he did live well past the war. So it wasn't a matter of him dying in 411. But he only gets to the part of the war in 411. And so kind of overall, this book is about the Peloponnesian War, the Athenians versus the Spartans, or the Peloponnesians, but Sparta being the main player in the Peloponnese. And so there's kind of these aspects of each that carry throughout the book. And so Athens is known as the progressive city. It is developing and creating an empire. The form of government is democracy. And you contrast that with Sparta, which is more on the conservative side. The form of government is an oligarchy. And so you see these main items in play, kind of the progressive democratic Athens versus the conservative oligarchic Sparta. And there's a fantastic section on page 40 of the book that goes through a set of differences between the Athenians and Spartans. And so you're getting that throughout the book. But again, to that first paragraph that I read, there's this huge aspect of motion and movement, and contrasted against other groups being motionless. And so you see that in a lot of the descriptions of the battles, or just even what different groups of people are doing. There are some that are in motion. There are some that are just waiting or not in motion. And so I'll get into that a little bit later. But in terms of what I thought was going to happen going into this work, I pictured in my head a sort of a Braveheart style large army on the Athenian side going against a large army on the side of the Peloponnesians, and just kind of, the armies moving from each respective location and just kind of working their way towards each other. And then they see each other in the battlefield, and they run towards each other and fight. And that's not what happens at all, not even close in this book. It is a war made up of proxy battles and sea battles. So that struck me immediately, just how off I was in my expectations of what was going to happen, thinking it was just kind of, warfare from way back. They're just going to be running towards each other and fighting. And it's not the case. A lot of these battles took place very far away from either Athens or Sparta or the Peloponnese, in lands far away. And so there are just all these different proxy wars going on. And then the importance of naval battles were what determined this war. And so land battles were obviously a part of it as well, but the naval battles were what really set the stage for a lot of this. Another big and key aspect of the Peloponnesian War, this work, is Thucydides' use of speeches. There are 141 different speeches in this book, and what they do is they create this tension and drama. And I just kind of thought of it like, how can Thucydides tell the story of the war here? He could just straight up tell you what happened. Like, this army went against this army, and then this army defeated this army by killing this many people. And then, there's this other naval battle, and the Athenians lost 10 ships. And then the other side, they lost 15 ships. And this is the number of people died. As a result, they got this land. And that's part of it. But what Thucydides does is uses these 141 speeches to just incredible effect. And the reason it creates this tension and drama is you're reading these speeches, but you don't know at that point how the audience is going to respond. Are they going to take what that general or that leader says to these people? Are they going to take that? Or are they going to reject it? And so it just kind of like it puts you just right in to the drama, the tension, the action of this war, and into these speeches. And at the beginning, Thucydides says, I heard some of these speeches. Others I gathered from what I've heard was said or what I think was probably said. So, it's not an exact, like he's sitting there writing every single word down, but it was incredible just to read these speeches. And at the end of so many of them, it said, and the people did what was recommended, or the action was taken based upon the speech. And so you get this idea that the speeches worked. In one set of speeches was so mind-boggling that I dedicated an entire episode to that. So I released that a few weeks ago. I'll link to that in the show notes. But those were the speeches of Pericles, and they were just phenomenal. So if you are into Thucydides, give that episode a listen as well, because those speeches were something very special. And you'll see those referenced quite often if you read other Greek literature or other books about ancient Greece. That was a really important set of speeches by Pericles. So what caused this war? Like how did it start? What got it going? What was going on 431 BC? Here's what Thucydides says, and this is on page 16 of the book. So this comes rather early in the work. He says, the growth of the power of Athens and the alarm which this inspired in Sparta made war inevitable. And so I marked that down. I wrote that in the very back of the book. here's what Thucydides says is the cause of the war at the very beginning. And then I just kind of kept that in mind to see, is this indeed the case? Is this what really led to the battles? Were there other things going on? And so if you're going to read this work, I recommend kind of just noting that, and then just as you read along, just see if that is the case. So the growth of the power of Athens and the alarm which this inspired in Sparta. And it's just kind of interesting with what I said earlier about Athens kind of being this progressive and democratic, but empire expanding power compared to Sparta being this conservative oligarchy. You even see that in that statement of the growth of the power of Athens. So this progressive growth, this empire building versus the alarm which this inspired in Sparta. You know, they're conservative. They're this growing power of Athens. This is scaring us. And Thucydides says this made war inevitable. Later on in some of the speeches that are given, the Spartans or the Peloponnesians, they would say, we're doing these battles to free you from the Athenian Empire. So that's also an interesting concept throughout this book is who has freedom? Is Athens, who is moving forward with this empire based on democracy? Are they giving freedom to the people they conquer, or are they enslaving people with this Athenian empire? And then, because Sparta can say, well, we're going to free you from these Athenians. So there's that kind of tension going on the whole time as well. So it's interesting to note that. As for Thucydides, the author of this work, when fighting broke out in 431 BC, he was probably around 30 years old. And then he died in his 60s or 70s, so he would have died in probably the mid-390s BC. I want to read a part at the very end of this book talking a little bit more about Thucydides. Thucydides, who served as a general and commanded a squadron of triremes himself, clearly viewed naval power as the key to supremacy in the Aegean. Athens' rise to empire and fall from glory was inextricably bound up with her fortunes at sea. End quote. So those are the ships they would use. It would be 3 levels of rowers that they could have. And so he commanded a squadron of those. And you just see all the naval battles in that. He would have kind of had a front row seat at some of those. As for overall themes in this book, there are quite a few. Some I want to highlight, and I will get into a little later in this episode, are the themes of panic, of striking panic in the opposing army, proxy wars versus close battles, movement, just this theme of movement as I mentioned earlier. There's this theme of technology throughout. So technology, whether it's ships or weaponry, there's one attack where they create like a fire, a flamethrower of sorts. And so just this aspect of technology and its importance in this many-year war. There's a theme or a lack of theme in the sense of religion does not play a big part in this, which is very striking after reading a lot of the Greek works, especially reading Homer. They're asking the gods for things, and the gods are very involved throughout that. You don't see that at all. You see very few references to even sacrifices made or that sort of thing. And so the theme of the lack of religion on Thucydides' parts in terms of what he highlights. Another theme is just the form of government, as I mentioned, democracy versus oligarchy. Those are kind of the 2 main ones, but there's also some other forms of government mentioned as well. And then there's this one section where revolution is compared to war. So revolution is within a certain area, whereas war would be two different groups fighting each other. But just the devastation that revolution can bring to an area, almost a civil war type of revolution in one particular area. This particular work was written between 431 and 411 BC, and again, the Peloponnesian War extended on to 404 BC. The version that I read was the Landmark edition. So the Landmark edition put out by Robert Strassler for the ones that I've read so far. So there's one with Herodotus, there's the Xenophon, there's this one, Thucydides, there's Julius Caesar, there's a number of them. But they contain maps, annotations, appendices, indexes, and just a ton of helpful footnotes throughout the book. The maps themselves are just phenomenal because the maps are placed in context. So you're reading about a particular area or a particular battle. Instead of having to like flip to the front of the book to get the map is right there, and all the places that are mentioned are listed. And so it is so helpful. I've heard that there's perhaps better translations than the one used in the Landmark edition, but this one, I would get this one just for helping you along on the way of reading this book. The translation was done by Richard Crowley, and I think it was done like 100 years ago, so it's been around for a while, but it was fine reading it. The introduction is done by Victor Davis Hanson for this particular work. And then at the end of the book, there's just a ton of appendices. I found this to be extremely helpful. I almost wish I had read them before getting into the work, just for the kind of bigger picture items that they cover. As for reading stats for this book, I read it between October 8th and November 12th. Of this year, 2024. It took me 29 hours and 17 minutes total. I track that. I'm just curious, and then I like to share that with maybe how long it might take you to read it. I read rather slowly, so that includes writing notes and all that as well. So that was 2 minutes and 41 seconds per page of the book, and so I average about 18 pages per day. It's pretty slow going. There's a lot of content on each page. I actually started this book in May. I read the first 2 books. There are 8 books that comprise this work. I read 2 of them, and then it just with other reading I had, it just got to be too much. So I shelved it until later this year. As for initial thoughts, I liked Herodotus more than Thucydides. It took me a long time to get the flow of Thucydides to where I don't know if it was just style or if it was just that it was so much information that it was hard to read. And so it just took me a while to get into it. Once I was into it, that helped. And what also helped is I was part of a Catherine Project group that was reading this book. So each week it's actually still going on. We're going to read Xenophon next, but we cover one of the books per week, and just discussing that with other people, seeing what stuck out to them, that sort of thing. That was very helpful in my reading of this work. So I would suggest that if you do plan to go through this work, try to read it with at least one other person. It's very dense. There's just so much going on. It's kind of hard to know, like, do I need to remember this particular battle and all that, or do I just focus on the big picture? I'll talk about that a little more in segment 3, but just know that it is it's an extensive work. For the remainder of this episode, I will have 2 more segments. So the next segment, I'm going to cover themes, quotes, and then just a little bit of military advice that Thucydides has. And then in segment 3, I will cover the one thing I'm still thinking about after having read the Peloponnesian War by Thucydides. First theme I want to cover here is that of movement. And throughout this book, we see 3 main areas of movement. And the first of those are a comparison between action versus inaction. And then the second is that of empire, of building or an empire retracting. And then the third is government, just a movement between types of government. So on the first, the side of action, let me read a couple parts here that contrast the Athenians and the Spartans. So the first one is this: "You Spartans of all the Hellenes are alone inactive, and defend yourselves not by doing anything, but by looking as if you would do something. You alone wait till the power of an enemy is becoming twice its original size, instead of crushing it in its infancy." End quote. So there you see the idea of the Spartans just kind of waiting and seeing what happens, while the other side is is gaining and they're growing. And so this idea of Spartan inaction while another side is acting quite strongly, and just how that plays out over time in not a very good way for the Spartans. Later on, and this shows up in book 8, there's a actual comparison here between the Spartans and the Athenians on this front. So here we go. The wide difference between the two characters, the slowness and want of energy of the Spartans, as contrasted with the dash and enterprise of their opponents, proved of the greatest service, especially to a maritime empire like Athens. End quote. So again, this idea of action versus inaction, and how important that ends up being in this war. All right, the next part of movement is that of empire. And we hear throughout this book of the building of the Athenian Empire. And for the Spartans and the Peloponnesians, they're gathering a group of allies together called the Peloponnesian League. But with the Athenians, they're building their empire, and that is a very important part of this book. And I want to read this part here. It's a speech by an Athenian, and just on the importance of continually building this empire, not stopping. So here we go. It is thus that empire has been won, both by us and by all others that have held it, by a constant readiness to support all, whether barbarians or Hellenes, that invite assistance, since if we are to keep quiet or to pick and choose whom we ought to assist, we should make but few new conquests, and should imperil those we have already won. Men do not rest content with parrying the attacks of a superior, but often strike the first blow to prevent the attack being made. Moreover, we cannot fix the exact point at which our empire shall stop. We have reached a position in which we must not be content with retaining what we have, but must scheme to extend it, for if we cease to rule others, we shall be in danger of being ruled ourselves. And I'll stop the quote there. It does continue on. But there's this idea, if you don't keep building the empire, if you don't keep feeding the empire and growing it, if there's not movement in that direction, you have the chance of losing it all. So the empire is this hungry beast that must continually be fed. And the Athenians think they have that right to empire building, really from the Persian War and their naval battles in that Persian War, the decisive battles that they were leading, and because of that, they almost feel like they have this manifest destiny to spread the Athenian Empire all around. But it does require movement. There's no, you can't just hold back. It always has to be getting more and more and more. And so you see that throughout this book as well. The third area of movement is in government. And we see the Athenians have democracy and the Spartans have oligarchy. But it's interesting that towards the end of the book, when the Spartans start getting the upper hand, the Athenians shift to oligarchy for a little while. And it goes very poorly. They eventually shift back to democracy, but there is this shift, and there's an interesting quote, just how once you shift to an oligarchy, it becomes less about deliberation and more about force, and so the rule becomes more by force, by killing and that sort of thing, and not by law. So interesting just to see the movement where Athens does go from a democracy to an oligarchy and then back again, but just the kind of the behind the scenes, what is causing that movement between the shifts in government. The second theme I want to highlight is that of panic, and panic shows up throughout this work. And it's a lot of the times it's the Athenians who are able to create panic in their enemies, and that just sets up a huge advantage for them. If your enemy is panicking, you can rout them easily. But then it goes beyond that, and it's not just like individual soldiers in a particular area of a battle. It's how panic can infiltrate an entire army. And then they become much easier to fight if they're in a panic. But it also extends beyond that into the into the cities and into the places like Athens, where the populace can hear about a battle and the results and begin to panic as a whole people group. So I want to read a few quotes on panic, and the first one comes pretty early in the book, and it says, "Fear takes away presence of mind, and without valor, art is useless." So this idea that fear or panic, it takes away presence of mind. It takes away the ability to think rationally, and you start making poor decisions, and you freeze. You don't know what to do. That makes it very easy for the enemy to come and defeat that. Next up, we've got hasten to engage as quickly as you can. That is our best chance of establishing a panic among them, as a fresh assailant has always more terrors for an enemy than the one he is immediately engaged with. End quote. So even in the strategy of trying to make it seem like there are more things going on, let's create a panic, because if we can kind of scare them about things that they can't see, that they will start to panic on that as well. Here's one a little bit later on. "Now all armies, and the greatest most of all, are liable to fears and alarms, especially when they are marching by night through an enemy's country and with the enemy near. And the Athenians now fell into one of these panics." End quote. And this was actually a major turning point in the book where this one takes place. This is in book 7, and they are on the island of Sicily. They're near Syracuse. The Athenians are, and they see all these fires, and they're not sure. It looks like they're just surrounded. It's dark. They don't know who's who, and so this panic ensues. And the Athenians were always the one that were creating the panic. And here the tides have shifted. The battle has shifted. They are now the ones panicking. Here we go back. This next quote is one where now we're back in Athens, and we see what panic can do to an entire area. "When the news of what had happened in Euboea reached Athens, a panic ensued such as they had never before known. Neither the disaster in Sicily, great as it seemed at the time, nor any other, had ever so much alarmed them." End quote. So after everything that happened in Syracuse in the quote before, now you've got another area even closer to Athens that has been attacked. Now that just panic ensues amongst the Athenians. And then in one of the appendices, Appendix F, there's a statement where stories of panic abound in Greek literature. And what's interesting about the word itself, panic, is it comes from the god Pan. And there's this aspect of it of noises in the dark or noises in the forest, and that causing this panic to ensue. The next big theme is that of land versus sea. And in general, in this book, the Athenians have the naval power. They have the sea advantage with their ships and experience in the Persian War. And the Peloponnesians usually attack by land. Now, that's not always the case, and there is a big shift later in this book. But that's generally the case. And what is really interesting on the land side of things is the Peloponnesians would come by land and move toward Athens. And they would either go to a place somewhat near Athens, or they would be like they were marching towards Athens. And while they would do that, the Athenians would get in their ships and sail around to where the Peloponnesians had come from and go like they were going to attack that area. So the Peloponnesians would catch wind of this, and they're gone. They're not able to defend this area, and now the Athenians are going to that area. So you imagine that these people's wives and kids and their homes and all that would just be destroyed, and so the Peloponnesians would be forced to go back to their home to defend it. And this would happen quite often. There are a number of situations where that happens, and it became almost humorous where the Peloponnesians are coming by land, the Athenians go around on the ship to their area and force them to return. But I found that very kind of interesting and funny how that would work on the land side of things. I want to now read about, and this is in one of the appendices. This is Appendix G, and this is about the triremes, the boats, the ships that were used. Because triremes were designed to maximize speed and minimize weight, almost every inch of space was used to accommodate rowers. There was hardly room for stretching, much less for sleeping or preparing and serving food. Thus, in addition to the necessity of regular beaching, triremes were constrained to travel along the coast and put in at night so that the crew could eat and rest. These logistical considerations affected the strategy and tactics, the pace, and sometimes even the outcome of battles. Fighting usually ceased at sunset, sometimes even at midday, in order to rest and feed crews quickly fatigued by their exertions in the stifling heat of cramped, closely packed quarters baked under the Mediterranean sun. In fact, several naval battles were won by one fleet surprising its enemy's crews ashore while they were on dinner break. Beaches where boats could put in and the crew could disembark for eating and sleeping were so vital to naval combat that the Spartans at Pylos could plan to drive away the Athenians' fleet simply by denying it access to all local landing places. And I'm going to continue a little bit lower. Finally, the shore station served as both a refuge and a base from which to organize a new attack in the event of defeat. For these reasons, naval battles were often amphibious affairs that included fiercely fought battles on land for control of the shore. The loss of a base camp was a serious setback, even for a fleet undefeated on the water, end quote. So that puts some of these naval battles into perspective as well. Just the importance of land for the naval battles. There needed to be a place where you could, you can't live on these ships. There's not sleeping quarters and that sort of thing. They were made for one purpose, and that of war, to where you didn't want to have extra space and extra weight for where people would be sleeping. So they would have to be on shore, and so just that aspect of the connection of land to these naval battles was so crucial. Thought that was interesting, just in thinking about land and sea battles in the Peloponnesian War. Next up here, I want to highlight a few quotes that really stuck out to me. So here's 11. Most of them are pretty short. Some I'll just read, some I'll comment on as well. So the first one is this: men's indignation, it seems, is more excited by legal wrong than by violent wrong. The first looks like being cheated by an equal, the second like being compelled by a superior. End quote. So people get upset when they seem to get more upset when it's a legal wrong as opposed to a violent wrong, because on the legal wrong, it seems like that is done by someone who is a peer, someone who is an equal, whereas a violent wrong is someone stronger than you or bigger than you, and like you're being compelled by force or something that is superior. Thought that was just interesting insight, and this book is full of those kind of statements, just kind of general insight into human nature. Next one here: in practice, we always base our preparations against an enemy on the assumption that his plans are good. Indeed, it is right to rest our hopes not on a belief in his blunders, but on the soundness of our provisions. Nor ought we to believe that there is much difference between man and man, but to think that the superiority lies with him who is reared in the severest school. End quote. Next up: for men can endure to hear others praised only so long as they can severely persuade themselves of their own ability to equal the actions recounted. When this point is passed, envy comes in, and with it incredulity. I love that one. All right. This next one is on national habits and just the question of what causes national greatness. What does the form of government have to do with it? That and all that. So here's a short quote. But what was the road by which we reached our position? What the form of government under which our greatness grew? What the national habits out of which it sprang? End quote. So I love that question. And I love the idea of national habits and what sets a nation apart. How can one nation be stronger in battle or to reach a higher position? How does that happen? And what are the habits behind it? What's the government that's behind it? What's the best form of government? Just some great things to consider in this book. Next up: where the rewards for merit are greatest, there are found the best citizens. Now I'll read about the importance of defense. I am of the opinion that national greatness is more to the advantage of private citizens than any individual well-being coupled with public humiliation. A man may be personally ever so well off, and yet if his country be ruined, he must be ruined with it. Whereas a flourishing commonwealth always affords chances of salvation to unfortunate individuals. Since then a state can support the misfortunes of private citizens while they cannot support hers, it is surely the duty of everyone to be forward in her defense. End quote. It's the importance of defense for a commonwealth, for a nation, and how the boat, the rising sea helps all boats, that idea, whereas one individual that's part of a bad society that gets overtaken, that person, no matter how well they're doing, they will also get taken. Next up, good policy against an adversary is superior to the blind attacks of brute force. This is a theme that shows up quite a bit, and kind of along those lines of law versus brute force. Good policy against an adversary is superior to the blind attacks of brute force. Next up, good deeds can be shortly stated, but where wrong is done, a wealth of language is needed to veil its deformity. End quote. It's a good one for our times. The safest rule of life is to take one's character and institutions for better and for worse, and to live up to them as closely as one can. End quote. I love that one. Just a simple way of life of there are going to be problems no matter what institution or whatever you're a part of, but try to live up to them as closely as you can, and for better or worse. And that's what he says is the safest rule of life. Thought that was great. Here is a part about the difference between oligarchy and democracy. So this is a paragraph that I'll read here. It will be said, perhaps, that democracy is neither wise nor equitable, but that the holders of property are also the best fitted to rule. I say, on the contrary, first, that the word demos, or people, includes the whole state, oligarchy only a part. Next, that if the best guardians of property are the rich, and the best counselors the wise, none can hear and decide so well as the many, and that all these talents, individually and collectively, have their just place in a democracy. But an oligarchy gives the many their share of the danger, and not content with the largest part, takes and keeps the whole of the profit, and this is what the powerful and young among you aspire to, but in a great city cannot possibly obtain. End quote. Just a whole lot of information in this book about those two forms of government in contrasting them. All right, last one I want to highlight here is in Appendix E, and this is about the Persians, and I just thought this was very interesting. It was largely through contact with Persia that the Greeks became acquainted with the accumulated knowledge of ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, and even India, so that it is not an accident that most of the first Greek philosophers, poets, and historians came from the cities of Asia Minor that had fallen under Lydian and later Persian rule. End quote. That was helpful just in other works that I've read. They're saying that a lot of the knowledge had been collected in Persia, the knowledge from ancient times, ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, and India. And so you even see that in where writers were located, and those closer to the Persian Empire were some of these authors and historians from ancient times. So that was, I loved that in Appendix E there. So next up in segment 3, I will cover the one thing I'm still thinking about after reading the Peloponnesian War. All right, I'm going to break protocol here and do a double one thing. So there'll be two things in this that I'm still thinking about. The first is that this book as a whole, I'm coming into reading Thucydides here after having spent most of this year reading the tragedy plays. And in the tragedy plays, there, especially the first ones by Aeschylus in the Oresteia, there's this emphasis on force versus deliberation, and what I like to call the Ares versus Areopagus. So Ares is the god of war, the god of force, and the Areopagus is where Athena establishes democracy. It's where law and deliberation are established. And so at a very high level, there are two ways to go. There's the way of force, and that's usually tied to the barbarians or the uncivilized in the Greek mind. And then the Greeks are the people of law and deliberation. And force is obviously connected to war. It's connected to brutality. It's connected to forcing someone to do something. Whereas deliberation is more civilized. It's tied to a higher form and being able to discuss things and discuss ideas. And so you see that throughout this work in what my first of the one things is that this idea that this work, the Peloponnesian War by Thucydides, is a working out of that force versus deliberation within the area of war. And so you've got the Athenian ideals of being able to work everything out through deliberation and all that. But you see how Athens treats those throughout this book that it has more power over. So it's one thing to be on equal power with another group, but we're looking here at realpolitik. We're looking at how things are actually done. And it's so interesting after having read all these tragedies and coming across all these ideals of, this is how things should be. There should be deliberation and all that, backed up by force, but we want there to be deliberation. And you even see that just in the aspect of there being 141 speeches in this book. There is this aspect of there being dialogue, of people having to persuade other people to take an action. And so that shows up, but then it's just so interesting to read this book through that lens of it being a working out of this. When do we use force? When do we use deliberation? When do we shift from deliberation to force if deliberation and talking things out is not working? So you see this with truces that are agreed upon. You see this through the battles and just the threats and all that. And I found it very. After a while of reading, I'm like, this is a working out of these ideas in the real world. And it's just interesting to see. The Athenians are not acting perfectly all the time. And so what is actually happening here in the world of realpolitik? So that was the first thing. The second thing is this idea that there's a potential for peace. And when the main time that can happen is amidst shared grief. And so there's one part where it says, both sides ceased to prosecute the war and turned their attention to peace. But after there being just really horrible battles and that sort of thing, there was this shared grief amongst the armies. And the reason this one stuck out is this was such a powerful message in the Iliad, in the final book of the Iliad, and the ransom that Priam brings. And Priam and Achilles could connect over their shared grief. And you just look at even battles in our day and age now, and what can solve these things? Is there anything that can solve these? You look at treaties trying to be made or peace deals or that kind of thing, and those things never seem to work. It just begs that question, is there a potential starting point for peace amidst grief when both sides have experienced so much grief that it can bring them together amidst that shared grief? And you see that just a little bit in this book, but it's the second major thing that stuck out to me in Thucydides. Real quick, just if you have not read this and you plan to, I just wanted to give some suggestions on how to read it. I read it one time through. It's a book that it should probably be read more than once. It took me 29 hours, so I'm not planning on reading it again anytime soon. So if you're just going to read it once, my suggestion is to take as many notes as you can while you're reading it, whether that's in the margins, whether that's in the back of a book, a separate notebook or whatever. Just take a bunch of notes that you can look back at, but try to focus on the big items. You want to be able to kind of get a broad scope for what is happening, who's fighting who, where are the battles taking place, what are the major themes, what are the major points that are being made, and to really focus on that while also kind of having these notes that you can refer back to if you need to. So one thing I did in a few of the chapters, especially for the reading group that I was a part of, is I would just kind of recap that chapter in the back, and then I could just look at that and see what was happening. So if you're just reading it once, kind of take that approach of a pretty slow read, but not getting frustrated with yourself if you're having trouble remembering things or that sort of thing, but just really trying to get the overarching picture of what is happening in the Peloponnesian War. If you are planning to read it more than once, I would use the first reading just to read straight through, not to do a slow read, but to really just read it straight through to get the overall picture. And then on that second read, use that to be the slower read where you're taking a lot of notes. You're really digging in deeper to a lot of things. But that first time, if you're going to read it twice, really just go in there to get the story down. I will link to a podcast episode that I listened to when I was reading this that was very helpful in framing some of the ideas in Thucydides, and really to the point of where I just never would have picked up on these things in a million years of reading this book, because there's so many deep aspects of this book. It's not just a history book, as Thucydides says in what I quoted in that first segment, is that this is something bigger than just a particular war. This is hitting into aspects of human nature, and that's why I talked about these themes that are going as well, of movement and that. In this one podcast episode that I listened to, it really helped kind of frame the deeper aspects of how Thucydides is talking about Homer and kind of refuting Homer, and is leaving out the gods on purpose, and what that means. And then even in this episode, the person talks about how later authors then used the ideas of Thucydides and how they wrote about different things. So if you're interested in digging a little deeper, that's probably like a hour and a half episode, and it was very helpful to me. So I'll link to that in the show notes. In closing, I do hope you read this one. I had a lot of trouble with it. It was hard for me to keep in the mode of reading it, in the sense of just remembering everything that was happening there. I mean, there's so many battles, there's so many people groups and types of warfare and just all these different things going on that it was very hard for me just to keep all of that in mind. And so I found myself getting frustrated with myself of, I'm forgetting major things here as I'm reading this. And I don't know if I need to kind of keep those in the forefront of my mind, or are they going to come back up and all that. But after having finished the book, the thing I'm glad I have is kind of knowing the overall structure of the war, the main themes, the main battles, what happened in those battles. And that is, despite it being a hard book to read, I'm glad I have that. This is actually helping me in considering the tragedies. Many of the tragedy plays were written and performed during the time of the Peloponnesian War. And so what does that mean? Especially for Sophocles and Euripides, were they writing about these battles? Like, were they writing in a different format to try and speak to the people of that time? And they did. And some of them I've read, I've picked up, whether it was in the notes or something where it said, this was performed at the time that this was happening in the Peloponnesian War. So this is why referencing this group of people or this action would have meant more to the original audience. It's just really cool now to kind of go back into the tragedies. I have a few remaining, but to go back into the tragedies with that in mind and really pay attention to the dates that these were written and performed, and just kind of know generally what was going on in the war at that time. So let me close out the episode here. I thank you for listening. I am now in Substack. That's where this podcast originates. And if you get value out of this podcast and you would like to share that value, I would greatly appreciate that. That would help me just cover some of the costs associated with this project. So I've got a plan for $5 a month, $99 a year, or $500 per year. There's 17 people currently supporting this podcast. And to you guys, thank you so much. I am currently reading Xenophon now, the Hellenika book, which basically picks up right where this one leads off. And so I'm doing that one as well with the Catherine project. And that I'm actually enjoying Xenophon more than Thucydides. So I enjoyed Herodotus the most, Xenophon, and then Thucydides. But that has been fun. Once I hit December here, I will get into my winter break where I pick up some books that are on my to-be-read pile. So that'll do it for this episode. Thank you for listening. I would love to hear from you. Please comment on this podcast episode in Substack if you have things to share. The reason I ask that is that then other people can comment on that, and we can really get a good dialogue going, good discussion going over this book. If you have something you want to share with me directly, please email me at Erik, E-R-I-K, at booksoftitans.com. You can follow Books of Titans on Instagram or Twitter. And my website, the Substack is booksoftitans.com. A website associated with this project is books.booksoftitans.com. And I have my great books reading list there. I have all reading lists from 2017 to 2024, and just a number of other tools there to help you create a reading list. I'll be back. I'll probably skip next week with Thanksgiving, and then I'll be back the week after that. So until then, keep reading, keep learning, and keep listening. I'm out.